these again.
Sorry.
It's okay. And then just a little reminder. I don't know why this isn't. There we go. Okay. Scenario D was made up of 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, which came in the second best for Q2, and those were the ones around Couples Park. And then scenario C was 1, 2, and 11, so more up toward Moortown. And then G, which was the best results, was just all of the modifications. And the second stakeholder goal we'll go over is to improve water quality. We had 2 different objectives for this one. So one of the objectives was to maximize the P storage. So a prediction model was used to estimate the amount of P potentially stored at each of the restoration locations. So this is Rebecca's model. And inputs such as inundation probability, channel slope, upstream drainage area, and the incision ratio before and after the modification was implemented was used for the estimate. So in this modification, or in this case, modification 11 had the largest estimate of P storage. Modification 2 had the second best phosphorus storage, both of which actually had the largest areas as well. And this is just another snapshot out of HECRAS, just showing the baseline conditions and then how they flood actually with a Q2 storm here. And for scenario 11, we have a little bit more flood and inundation there. And in HECRAS, we're able to change the Manning's end value. So that's how we modeled a wetland restoration. We changed the land type to wetland area. Go to the next one. So the second measure of potential water quality improvement relied upon the P crediting framework that's being developed in the FFI to track projects implemented under the Lake Champlain TMDL. And this crediting method considered multiple factors such as project type and area, the land cover, and again, the existing and modified incision ratio. And we assumed here that the higher the P credit value, the more effective the project is estimated to be administratively. And again, the highest P credit values we see are for modification 11, and the second best was modification 2, and both being those largest modification areas. And the third stakeholder goal we'll go over is to minimize the socioeconomic impacts. So the initial construction costs were estimated using the average price of recent floodplain reconnection and wetland restoration projects implemented in Vermont. And then for each modification, we just summed up the applicable restoration, forest buffer, and culvert costs. And then for each scenario, we just summed up the modification costs that made up the scenario. And then we actually, in order to make it work with the optimization, we made this an annual cost, assuming 6% interest and a 40-year project lifespan. And we see modification 11 had the highest costs and modification 2 had the second highest cost. And this was an input that we were hoping to minimize. Okay. And then the second objective, quantified for the goal of minimizing socioeconomic impacts, was a lost commercial revenue. Because floodplain areas are targeted for restoration are also in demand for developed uses, we represented the lost commercial revenue from the community perspective, defined as a lost commercial revenue from lost tax revenue or lost potential business development when the land is put into conservation as a result of implementing a restoration project. So we first checked the zoning ordinance to see if each of the areas that made up the modification, if they were even buildable. And then we also checked if the lands were previously conserved. So we checked out the Vermont Protected Land Database. And once we determined the land type and whether it was conserved or not, we actually had values for agricultural, unrestricted and conserved, and forest, unrestricted and conserved. And we multiplied those values by actually a conservation easement that we created. So for this calculation, we actually looked at the stream line and the property lines and tried to get a larger, kind of more accurate conservation or conservation easement area. And just to match up with our previous cost calculation, we assumed this would be an annual cost with a 6% interest rate. So next I'm going to get into results. So as part of the optimization, we looked at all of the five stakeholder objectives together to determine which projects ranked the best by maximizing the first three objectives and minimizing the costs. And regardless of storm size, we actually came up with the same ranking of scenarios. So from best to worst, we had scenario B as the best, which was 1 in 11. Then we had scenario C as 1, 2, and 11. Scenario D, which was 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 near the couple's field. And then scenario G with all of the modifications. And then we had scenario E, which was that 4, 4, and 6. So just the berm removal at Couples Field. Then we had scenario F, which was 3, 9, and 10. And then our last ranking scenario was the baseline. Oops, sorry, I thought someone raised their hand. So the top ranked scenarios B and C seem to achieve a balance between the multiple objectives of the many stakeholders working for improved water quality, enhanced flood resiliency, and then minimizing those socioeconomic impacts. Both scenarios included modification 1, which achieved the greatest increase in inundation depth, and modification 11, which had the largest P credit and P storage values because of its larger footprint. And scenario B, I think, ranks higher than scenario C because scenario C also included modification 2, which didn't see much increase in depth, but had that additional cost factor to it. And despite having the highest costs, scenario G's middle ranking suggests that the water quality benefit balance these costs as well. I'll go. Sorry, I'm frozen. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. So to answer each of our stakeholder goals of did floodplain reconnection improve flood resiliency? So the results captured at modification sites themselves indicated increased inundation in the restored floodplain areas. There was negligible changes in depth, duration, stream power, and velocity along the entire model domain in areas outside of the restoration locations. And for all the scenarios, we did not see much evidence of a decrease in peak discharge. So for scenario G, where all the modifications were included, the largest decrease in peak discharge at the downstream boundary occurred with the Q25 storm, which had like about a 1% decrease. And this could be due to the robustness of the 2D HEC-RAS model, which may not be able to detect these changes. Also, the scenarios modeled had a small footprint, making up 0.5 to 9.2% of the 500-year floodplain area. And the steeper gradient of 0.3% on average of the Mad River could also limit the potential for flood wave inundation as well. But in this case study at modification 1, which had the lowest channel slope of all the modifications at about 0.19%, it also had the greatest depth increase of all the modifications. And also we can see that at the other modifications 2, 3, and 11, which were included in those top best scenarios, are also at this lower slope stretch of the river. And in a paper by Schultz and Doyle that came out in 2011, they found that reaches that have a slope less than 0.1% do have the greatest flood wave attenuation, which backed up this find. So for our next goal, did floodplain reconnection improve water quality? Yes. So under the Lake Champlain TMD implementation plan, the Mad River watershed is required to reduce its P load by 68 kilograms per year. And each of the scenarios besides E and F would meet this reduction when considering the P credit values, and each of the scenarios would meet this reduction when considering the predicted P storage values. Therefore, from a water quality standpoint, these projects would be highly successful in meeting the TMDL goals. Scenario C, which included modifications 1, 2, and 11, had the highest, second highest P credit and storage values. And scenario G had the highest P credit and storage values. But when we look at these values, the empirically predicted P storage values are greater by 4 to 9%, or 4 to 9 times the TMDL assigned P credit values over the 40-year project lifespan. So considering that the P credit values are used to estimate the cost benefit ratio of these nature-based solutions, determining a closer estimate between the crediting values could be very important to help monetize the environmental benefits and justifying the project costs. So monitoring of the P storage on floodplain and the water quality after river restoration projects are completed could help determine what the actual P storage values are and further help to developing the credit and storage estimates that are more representative of this recorded monitoring data. And it's been found that monitoring is needed for an extended period of time, greater than 10 years, in a study from 1995 to evaluate the success of restoration projects. But in a study performed in 2007 by Alexander and Allen, they found that in their interviews, monitoring was the step that most planners admitted needed change, but given the constraints of time and money, was difficult to do. But such long-term monitoring data sets could allow for a better estimate of water quality effectiveness for these smaller projects, which could help monetize the environmental benefits over the long term. And for our last goal, that worked. Did floodplain reconnection minimize socioeconomic impacts? So as the floodplain reconnection area increased, the cost did as well, but also the floodplain P load storage increased as well. So this decreased the amount of P loading to the lake. So on this plot, the floodplain reconnection area is on the x-axis, just going from none to a high floodplain reconnection area. And the costs are represented on the green axis, going from low to high costs, and the P loading going from low to high on this blue axis. So with scenario A, for example, there was no floodplain reconnection area that was being modified, and the costs were really low, but the P loading going to the lake was still very high because we didn't add any increased storage. But as we increased the floodplain reconnection area being modified, the costs got higher, but the P loading that would go to the lake got lower as we get up to scenario G. And scenario G had the best water quality benefits, having the highest P credit and P storage values, but it also had the highest costs. And that B and C projects that came in as the best kind of gave us that middle ground where they have medium floodplain reconnection areas compared to other scenarios, but also have the medium costs and medium P loading results. And that, I believe, I got to the end, and any questions you might have, I can.
And Lindsay, maybe you could go back to a slide that shows the location of those scenarios B and C, just to kind of help us think about where those are located.
Is this one too small? Would it be helpful if I went back? Maybe I'll. Or is that okay?
Yeah, that'll work.
That'll work. Okay. That's actually okay. There we go.
Yeah, if you turned on, is that scenario C right there?
That's scenario C, and then
That's highlighted.
Yeah, and scenario B is 1 and 11.
Okay.
So can someone tell us where 1 and 2 are? We now know that 11 is down by the dam, right? In Moortown.
Yep. And modification site number 1 is just downstream of the Moortown village. If you're heading north, it's on the left, and it's just before Route 100 crosses over the river again.
It's where all the cows are really close to the river, and there's no
exactly.
buffer.
And modification site 2 is upstream, closer to Waitsfield Village. I believe it's just to the north of the Waitsfield Elementary School, but it would be on the west side of Route 100.
So is Wren compares?
Probably, yeah.
Where there just was logging done?
Well,
west side, no.
No?
It's the two fields are split by Route 100. Is that right, Kristen?
Correct, yeah.
It's like by the Waitsfield Champlain Telecom, Kenny, right before that.
Okay. Yep.
It's actually that field on the west side, the southern side of that number 2 is the field where the Path Association just built the sort of more the Waitsfield Elementary wider path along the river.
And the other side, is it that Waitsfield Telecom field?
Yeah, I don't know who owns that. I don't know if Wren does or if Waitsfield Telecom does.
Waitsfield Telecom does.
Okay.
And that field floods.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a,
And what was number 2? Like, what was was it berm removal and floodplain reconnect lowering, or what was the sort of best management practice?
Yeah, berm removal and floodplain lowering. So for 2, it was more floodplain lowering, and then we had the 2 culverts going through the road.
And
Just
just out, I mean, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, just to enhance that connection under the road.
I'm wondering, so when was the LiDAR done that informed this study? What year was that flown?
I believe 2017.
Okay, I wonder if I can't remember if that was before the path, because they sort of, unfortunately, a little bit of a berm got added
Oh,
when the structure was built.
fun.
So what I was getting at is could potentially be even more valuable if that berm went away than what you're modeling.
Right, good point.
so in scenario 2, that's 2 culverts that go under Route 100.
Yeah.
And Adelaide, it looks like you have a question.
I did. So I'm just curious, as a follow-up question, do you know what the resolution of the LiDAR was that was used for the study?
I think that
I
was the
don't-
0.7
Rebecca
here.
does. Yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah, it's the state, well, the QL2 is 0.7, so any of the updated stuff is 0.7.
Okay, great.
And did you guys see my comment about number 11?
No, I missed that. Sorry.
No, the river flows quite differently there now because that little tiny,
Yeah.
yeah. So I don't know if that affects your information or not.
That's a great point. That avulsion happened like probably after, certainly after 2017 when the LiDAR was flown.
Mhm.
So it would potentially affect the way things flow through there, at least at lower flood levels. Probably not, possibly not at higher flood stages like the 100-year or the 500-year.
So Kristen, you're like the flood storage capacity would be perhaps be similar, but maybe some of the water quality numbers would be different. Is that kind of what you mean, or?
I think flood storage would be similar. The way that we have chosen to model the water quality improvements here, I don't think would change dramatically either. It's just that you would need to consider it as somewhat dated analysis, pre-avulsion, pre-channel shifting.
I mean,
So-
that oxbow is filled in a bit with sediment over time. So, it's probably different, but order of magnitude and just like understanding kind of the relative impact of a project in that setting is probably not that different.
And can I jump in and ask, so is that mostly owned by Pony Farm or is that more? Do we know?
Yeah,
Have we looked at ownership, I guess is. the
it's also a
question.
really high quality or a high value river corridor easement parcel, and several different owners make up the land. It's the Maynard farm, some of it's Maynard's, 2 different Maynards, and one is the field across from that's owned by the Craig Ashkello or the Ashkellos.
Mhm.
So
Oh,
it's
yeah.
the ownership is not in one party.
Thank you, Corey.
Hey, Brian, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm wondering if you could go back to the slide where you were providing some of the economic background. I understand the 6% discount rate, but I'm a little bit confused about how you estimated the value of a lost business opportunity. So that would be question 1. And the second question I have relates to maybe another way to look at the outcomes. And I'm wondering if you have computed a cost per kilogram of phosphorus to make the projects a little bit more directly comparable. You mentioned that some of those projects were significantly larger than others, hence the bigger price tag. With the basin water quality commissions, I'm working on that for the Winooski Basin, and we have an estimated cost per kilogram of phosphorus, and I'm wondering if or how close some of these projects might actually meet that target number.
For the second question, we did not calculate a cost per kilogram.
But we could easily do that as a follow-up for sure.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting and just add a bit more weight to the argument to help prioritize projects. At some point, the Basin Water Quality Control or Basin Water Quality Commissions will be ranking and prioritizing projects, and at least some of that will be cost-based on the per unit cost for a kilogram of phosphorus.
Mhm. Yeah, great point. Thank you, Brian. And then Lindsay, the first part of that question, how we calculated the lost commercial revenue?
Yeah, so we use the cost per acre of land type in order to estimate this. So we got a value per acre for agricultural, unrestricted or not conserved, that was buildable land. And we got this as an estimate of $3,750. And then we had a value for agricultural that was conserved, because we were restoring it and adding there's already a conservation easement. So we're not necessarily taking this land away from future development. So that was estimated at $2,850. And then we did the same thing for forest, unrestricted and conserved. And these were lesser values at a little over 1,000 each. And then we
So-
multiply.
Okay, so it's just the total area of project impact times the land value estimate that you have here.
Yes, and we went in and tried to estimate a more conservation easement area. So not just the modification site, but looking at property lines and stream lines. So this area is a bit bigger than the actual modification site because we knew we weren't gonna probably do like a little tiny part of a parcel.
Well, you'll probably hate this suggestion if you're in your 5th year of your PhD, but as a person that took 10, I feel like I can offer you another more work suggestion. If you're already using the parcel data, I think it would be more interesting to use the grand list and the actual property values as opposed to generalized estimates, because that generalized estimate almost certainly comes from beyond the extent of a single real estate market. And so, well, that's a topic for a different discussion. The parcel data is in good enough shape and easy enough at this point to work with the grand list that I think that would improve the information that you're presenting in your results. If this was 2003 when I first started using the grand list, I would not ever be so cruel to recommend that anyone should try to do what I'm suggesting. But I really think this is you know, a couple days potentially worth of work to identify the parcels and the appropriate grand list data that goes along with it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's all very accessible these days. So yeah, great suggestion.
So Kristen, I remember, and I may misremember, but I remember last year when we met and we were talking about the property across the road or across the river from the couple's field as a real actual potential site.
Yeah.
Did you guys do any modeling further beyond that with that parcel?
Yes, so that is, Lindsay, if you could go to the overall map. Yeah, that's 6, 7, and 8, right? The parcel to the east side.
Oh, great, thank you.
Yeah, so it definitely was included and came out as one of the more highly ranked.
Thank you.
Yeah. Because I believe, if I remember correctly, there was maybe one landowner there, so that makes
Exactly.
it more feasible.
And he has conservation values in, you know,
Yeah.
in his heart.
Yeah, yeah.
But it wasn't calculated separately, right? Because I see 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 is the only scenario that includes it. So that would also include 4 and 5.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Is there a way to tease that apart?
We have the individual values for each modification, so we might be able to get some estimates. We didn't run the HEC-RAS model with them separately, but we could get some estimates just using the results of each of the modifications.
I think we'd find that interesting, but I think this is good information to talk with the landowner too.
It definitely is interesting on a per parcel basis, even number 2 here as well, like that being pulled out separately, because that is also one parcel, right? So any of these situations where there's a single landowner would be really useful for conversations.
Well, and also grant applications to actually get the project done.
True. I have a question, and I might be simple for asking it, but in the 11, that upper polygon, can you talk about what the model is actually, or what the recommendations actually are there? Because that site, that upper polygon, is like 25 feet above the the base flow of the river. And I don't know what you would do there.
For 11, we changed the whole area, the Manning's end value in the HEC-RES model to wetland. I'm not sure about the height. If
Yeah.
I do have the picture here.
Because the lower polygon, like that bigger, the farm field and all that stuff is really close to the river in sort of elevation, but that upper section is,
Yeah, and you can actually see in the model that it wasn't actually being flooded. So that area really didn't change. like
okay,
you said.
okay. That makes sense.
But on the other hand, the function of a wetland is to absorb floodwaters. So the idea is it would retain water rather than letting it move or spill over somewhere.
Yeah, and I'm kind of having a hard time. I mean, I understand the concept, I guess, broadly of wetland restoration, but in this site, I'm trying to understand like what it would be that would need to be done to accomplish these outcomes. Aside from like stop farming, is that, do you all have a sense of what this practice like looks like that would accomplish these goals or these outcomes?
I just happen to be reading about this week. And what it requires is it requires an analysis of what exactly does need to be done.
Yeah.
Whether
okay.
it's vegetation, whether it's removing vegetation that isn't native.
Yeah.
And seeing, what on the borders of the wetland, what's causing the issues. So in other words, what can degrade the borders of a wetland can be too much commercial development, or yes, you're right, too much farming development. So you have to go there, see what's there, go with a wetlands expert and get a determination of if you do this, the wetland will function as it should. It could just be that the wetland isn't functioning at its best and you can make it better. The idea is to retain the water and the phosphorus.
And Kristen and Lindsay, I feel like last year there was a culvert proposed there that would reconnect under Pony Farm Road. Is that not part of this scenario?
Yeah, you're remembering correctly. That there was a connection that would enhance connection off to the east, as you mentioned, across Pony Farm Road, but it just didn't. It wasn't quite feasible given the topography of that area, the slopes in that area, and so we eliminated that from our consideration.
Okay, thanks.
Can I ask about culverts?
Sure.
In area 2, it's a simple question. What would the culverts accomplish there? And where do they drain to?
They're to allow access through the road and out to this modification area. So right now, modification 2, and you would know more, it seems in the HEC-RES model at least floods in the larger storms, but it actually just goes right over the road. So the culverts would allow more kind of safe access of the water through the roads out to this area.
Especially at lower flood stages. And typically in a floodplain lowering project, you consider lowering the whole floodplain up adjacent to the river, but in this case, that's a state route, and we assume that would be, we wouldn't be moving the State Route 100, and so in order to accomplish that extra connectivity, we'd have to install some cross culverts to
Okay,
guide water underneath.
I say, and then the idea is that restoration area there becomes like water retaining?
Yes.
Okay.
I have a question. How do you calculate the capture and loss? And if it's inundated, again and again, is there a sloughing off of phosphorus? How do you figure that out?
So we don't account for that. And maybe Kristen has a more answer, but in HECGAS, we were taking the depth results and just taking the difference between the actual baseline and how the modification affected the inundation depth. But in the model, we haven't or can't really account for that kind of phosphorus dependence on,
Yeah.
like you're saying, yeah.
Yeah, and the follow-up question would be that with the increased erosion, with the weather changes, there's going to be more phosphorus coming down, and I don't know how that would enter into something, a study like this. Maybe it's just an asterisk that this is something for a future consideration.
Yeah, and I think that's really where the monitoring would help, to be able to really put that in some of the P storage and P crediting values that we're using to estimate kind of how those effects in different storms coming one after another would affect the storage values.
Thank you.
Oh, maybe Kristen has more to add too, but that's.
Oh, I think you handled that well. Yeah, we didn't really model that. The model itself is really estimating or simulating water movement, and we're having to make some assumptions about sediment settling velocities and deposition in these floodplains.
So can I jump in?
Sure.
If in a wild bit of luck, the couples field decided to go for removing the berm, is there any modeling, perhaps this is a question for Rebecca, since that portion of the river is straightened, at least it certainly has been, we've been told by fluvial geomorphologists who've done assessments on the river that that area is straightened. If you remove the berm, the river is it just removing the berm, or is it removing riprap? Is it, would it affect the movement of the river to take a more natural turn and then therefore affect, have more sinuosity and therefore affect a whole lot more soil going in and phosphorus? Okay, that was not a clear question, but when berms have been removed in other places, how does the river respond? Maybe that's the question.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Kenny, that when berms have been removed in other locations, and particularly if there is riprap or armoring associated that is also removed, then certainly and there's no riparian vegetation there to stabilize those floodplain soils, then the tendency of the river is to regain those meanders, and you will see lateral adjustments there. But we could, there's a number of ways to approach these projects, either kind of passively or actively or some combination of the two. And at this particular site, I think we envisioned, at least for the purposes of simulating these project sites, that berms would be removed and there'd be a lowering of the floodplain, but we did not simulate the re-meandering of the river plan form.
Thank you.
But what is being captured by the berm removal in this model is just opening up more floodplain during, more flood events. I'm guessing you understood that part of it. And that's what's being represented at this point, but there are kind of other processes that I think you're referencing, Kenny, that will likely take place.
So like phosphorus gains I'm not suggesting these projects are not good ideas, but phosphorus gains may be followed by more phosphorus deposition as the channel meanders and erodes in that location, and then elsewhere there might be aggradation.
Right.
And you also, I mean, you know, as your river channel sort of re-equilibrates, you might get some localized bank erosion, right? And so that's the natural process.
Right. I mean, I guess I'm just wondering, with all the focus on the TMDL, like how that figures into calculating. I suspect it doesn't, which is great.
Well, over the long run, though, it will,
Yeah.
you know, again, it might be localized in short term.
Right.
And then the river will find its new sort of equilibrium. It'll be happier.
Right.
And kind of be retaining a greater amount.
For sure. And actually accessing those floodwaters, accessing the floodplain dissipates some of that energy. If we left it as it is now, that's kind of a very entrenched channel that actually contains large floods and contributes to erosion during those big floods. Whereas if we lower the floodplain, give it access to the floodplain, we can dissipate those energies of the high flood events.
So Lindsay and Kristen, I'm aware of the time, and did you have specific questions for us or places you want? I mean, I realize we're kind of on a timeline maybe that's beyond the opportunity for that, but I wanted to make sure you had a chance for that, if that's helpful.
Honestly, mostly we just wanted to circle back with you all and provide results of these analyses. You've already given us some great suggestions and feedback that Lindsay can incorporate, and we can come back to you with, but we didn't have specific questions
Okay.
for you at this point.
Okay. Thank you. We have, I think, time for one more question if somebody has something burning. In that case, thank you so much, Lindsay. Thank you so much, Kristen. Good to see you. Good to get a little dose of science. Very helpful. And I'm going to stop the recording right now, and then I'll figure out how to, actually mostly probably Ira will figure out how to get this on.